The public discourse is fixated on the kinetic cost of war. The launch of a missile, the movement of a tank column. This is a deliberate misdirection. The primary vector of systemic risk is not the projectile. It is the preceding silence. A full-spectrum attack does not begin with a bang. It begins with the calculated severance of a nation's senses. The true nervous system of a global power is not fortified in a bunker. It lies exposed on the abyssal plains of the ocean floor and in the silent vacuum of low Earth orbit. Analysts at CSAIS confirm that undersea data cables and satellite constellations are the foundational assets for economic solvency and military command. They represent the ultimate asymmetric leverage. Cheap to attack, existentially expensive to lose. This is not theoretical. On January 8th, a U.S. Navy MQ-4C Triton, call sign BLK Cat 6, executed a 10-hour surveillance mission over the Caribbean. While legacy media views this as routine, it is a component of a larger strategy, mapping and defending these sensory assets against an adversary pushed toward a solvency crisis. As Ukraine reports Russian conventional losses are reaching unsustainable levels, the mathematical incentive for Moscow to pivot from kinetic to asymmetric warfare intensifies daily. This pressure creates the single most dangerous entity in geopolitics, the blind Leviathan. A state stripped of its satellite vision and subsea data flow does not become passive. It retains its full kinetic arsenal, its nuclear triad, but loses all capacity for proportional response. It can no longer differentiate a sensor ghost from a decapitation strike. In this state of sensory deprivation, launch-on warning protocols become a systemic liability. A minor probe, a severed cable, a jammed signal is no longer a localized problem. It is an existential threat trigger. The attrited, cornered state is mathematically forced to escalate asymmetrically, turning every minor incident into a potential tripwire for strategic failure. The greatest risk is not that they will attack, it is that we will make them blind. And a blind Leviathan swings at shadows. The kinetic conflict is not the primary vector of risk. The war is a solvency crisis. A state, like a corporation, has assets and liabilities. Its primary kinetic asset is manpower. According to intelligence reports cited by Al Jazeera, Russian attrition rates are now reaching unsustainable levels. This is not merely a military problem, it is a balance sheet crisis. The state is liquidating its most critical asset at a rate that guarantees systemic failure. When a war becomes this costly, it transforms from a foreign policy tool into a domestic liability. Analysts at RUSI and CSIS confirm the correlation. As casualty counts rise, domestic political stability erodes. The regime cannot absorb a conventional defeat because the political cost is terminal. It has passed the point of no return. A conventional loss is now synonymous with internal collapse. This is the corner they have engineered for themselves. This forces a pivot. It is a mathematical certainty. When a state can no longer afford the kinetic cost of a proportional response, it has no choice but to change the equation. It must leverage its only remaining solvent asset, its strategic deterrent. This is the pivot to asymmetry. The state's weakness in the conventional domain makes it paradoxically more dangerous in the unconventional. The result is a structural lowering of the nuclear threshold. The state loses the luxury of nuance. It can no longer differentiate between a low-level probe, like the MQ-4C Triton surveillance missions reported in the Caribbean, and a precursor to a decapitation strike. Its response protocol is forced into a launch-on-warning posture. Every minor conventional action against it becomes a tripwire for a full-spectrum strategic failure. The central equation of modern warfare has been inverted. According to the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, the kinetic cost exchange is now terminally broken. A state invests $5 million in a main battle tank, an asset representing decades of engineering and a complex supply chain. The adversary counters it with a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a balanced fight. It is an economic annihilation. This radical cost asymmetry creates a solvency crisis on the battlefield. For a nation suffering unsustainable attrition, trading a $5 million asset for a $500 threat is a non-viable economic model. It guarantees bankruptcy. This phenomenon is known as the democratization of violence. The diffusion of hyperlethal capabilities from state-level actors to non-state or lower-tier actors. The barrier to entry for inflicting strategic-level damage is no longer a superpower's GDP. It is a credit card and an internet connection. This is the blueprint for systemic risk. When a conventionally weakened state, bled dry by this inverted economy of lethality, can no longer afford a proportional response, its strategic calculus is fundamentally altered. It loses the luxury of escalation control. It cannot absorb the loss of its remaining high-value assets to what it perceives as low-value threats. The mathematical certainty is this: the state will be forced to reclassify the threat. The $500 drone is no longer a tactical nuisance. It is an existential vector. Each probe becomes a potential tripwire, forcing the state to leverage its only remaining asymmetric advantage to deter not a peer state invasion, but insolvency. This is how a conventional conflict degrades into a launch-on-warning protocol for strategic nuclear failure. On January 8th, a U.S. Navy MQ-4C Triton, call sign BLK-CAT-6, executed a 10-hour surveillance mission from Naval Station Mayport. The operational vector was the Caribbean. This was not a routine patrol. It was a calibration exercise, a low-cost probe to measure an adversary's response threshold under conditions of extreme stress. The target system is experiencing what CSIS analysts term a kinetic solvency crisis. Reports citing Ukrainian intelligence assert that Russian combat attrition is reaching unsustainable levels. When a state's capacity for conventional asset replacement is outpaced by its rate of loss, it loses the ability to engage in proportional response. It becomes a cornered liability. This is the operational logic behind staging probes in a gray zone like the Caribbean. It functions as a proxy laboratory. The goal is to test the breaking point in a theater where the kinetic cost of engagement is low. This pattern mirrors systemic instability vectors seen elsewhere. Warnings for regions like South Africa or Canada are merely symptoms of the same strategy, identifying staging grounds for asymmetric leverage. The mathematical certainty is this: a state bled by attrition cannot afford a conventional response to even a minor probe. It is forced into an asymmetric posture. This turns every surveillance drone, every minor incursion, into a potential tripwire for strategic failure. The ultimate leverage is used not out of strength, but because it is the only economically solvent option remaining. The final command protocol is not launch on impact, it is launch on warning. This doctrine, as analyzed by RUSI, is a systemic feature of nuclear deterrence. Once a nation's early warning network detects an incoming strategic strike, it must launch its own arsenal before those assets are liquidated in their silos. There is no second chance. It is a zero-sum calculation of asset preservation. The critical liability in this equation is the warning itself. In a kinetic-only world, the warning is satellite and radar data. But the modern accelerant is cyber warfare. A sophisticated attack vector designed to blind these systems creates what military strategists at CSIS refer to as the fog of digital war. The radar screens go black. The satellite feeds terminate. The commander is now forced into a solvency crisis of information. He must make a binary choice based on an absence of data. Is the blindness a technical failure, or is it the deliberate opening move of a decapitation strike? This is the asymmetric tripwire. When a state is already facing what Ukrainian intelligence calls unsustainable levels of attrition, its tolerance for ambiguity approaches zero. In this state of high alert and degraded conventional capacity, even a low-level probe like the U.S. Navy's MQ-4C Triton surveillance mission is no longer perceived as routine. For a leadership bled by attrition, it is a potential trigger. In the fog of digital war, fear becomes the final arbiter. The launch becomes mathematically predictable. Within the next 12 months, a major U.S. East Coast logistics hub will experience a catastrophic, non-kinetic failure. Expect a digital blackout at a port like Jacksonville or Norfolk, or a cascading power grid failure targeting a key data center cluster. The event will be officially attributed to critical infrastructure malfunction or a non-state ransomware actor. This is not a prediction. It is a forecast based on a new, observable doctrine. This event will be a calibration shot, a deliberate, attribution-ambiguous signal. The vector for this action is not aggression, but a solvency crisis. As confirmed by sources from Al Jazeera to CSIS, Russian conventional forces are facing unsustainable attrition. A state that can no longer afford the kinetic cost of a tit-for-tat response does not simply surrender. Its strategic calculus shifts from proportional warfare to asymmetric leverage. The trigger is logged as routine. Public data confirms that on January 8th, a U.S. Navy MQ-4C Triton ISR platform, call sign BLK-K86, executed a 10-hour surveillance mission from Naval Station Mayport. To Pentagon strategists, this is a low-risk probe. To an adversary bled of conventional options, it is a direct stimulus activating a pre-calculated, non-kinetic response protocol. The resulting blackout is not an act of war. It is a communication. It demonstrates a credible, non-attributable capability to impose massive economic cost in response to even minor conventional military action. It recalibrates the definition of a tripwire, shifting the battle space from the kinetic to the systemic. Every low-level probe now carries the implicit risk of strategic economic failure.